In March of 1856, a dead body washed onto the shores of the Mississippi River. Nothing out of the ordinary. In those days, people fished corpses from the river with alarming frequency. But this body, with its arms and legs tied to the chair, struck an especially eerie chord. Welcome to Uncommon History of the South podcast, where we uncover little-known facts of uncommon history. History is full of curious stories you will never discover in any textbook. We uncover fun facts about historical people, interesting places, and everything in between. Hello and welcome to Uncommon History of the South. I'm Brian.
And I'm Harold.
Our guest tonight has written for a number of magazines, journals, guest columns about Kentucky and the relevance of history. His columns regularly appear in newspapers across the Commonwealth. He's the author of 4 books, including the new one, Murder on the Ohio Belle. Stuart Sanders, thank you for taking time to be part of Uncommon History of the South. Stuart, you write about history, Kentucky, and the value of our past. How did you become interested in history?
Well, first of all, thank you both for having me. I've been looking forward to this. And so I grew up in Lexington, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, which is the burial place of both Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. So I grew up surrounded by history. My father taught history at Washington Lee University for about 43 years. And, it's just something I've always been interested in. I was, when we went to the school library, I was the kid flipping through World War II books. And then just, ended up working at the Lee Chapel, which is Robert E. Lee's burial site when I was in high school, and got hooked on museums too. So it's just something that, I've always been interested in and very appreciative of too.
So it was kind of a family tradition, I guess, the love of history.
Right. Yeah. My dad was lucky enough to have a sabbatical for about 6 weeks. We went to England when I was about 8 years old. And, that had a huge impact on me too, as you can imagine, getting to go to, some of the world's best museums, the Tower of London, and, walking Hadrian's Wall, and just, really getting 6 weeks of brainwashing about the importance of history. So, it's been something that I've always been interested in, and just really thankful to have had those experiences growing up.
Wow. So your new book is Murder on the Ohio Belle. What are your other 3 books? That way our listeners will kind of know some of your other books as well.
Yeah, sure. The first one I wrote was is called Perryville Under Fire: The Aftermath of Kentucky's Largest Civil War Battle. And that one looks at how civilians and really the surrounding communities around Perryville contended with the aftermath of the Battle of Perryville. My second book was The Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, which is a short history of that battle, which took place near Somerset in January of 1862. And it was an important early turning point in the war. And then my third book was called Manny's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville. And it looks at one Confederate brigade that was tasked with crushing the Union left flank at the battle and really turning the left and pushing that back. And many of those regiments sustained about 50% casualties. And so it was one of the hardest fighting brigades at the Battle of Perryville. And then again, the fourth one that you just mentioned, Murder on the Ohio Belle, which just came out, is mainly about a couple of murders that took place on a steamboat called the Ohio Belle in 1856. But it really looks at sort of bigger themes like interpersonal violence, vigilante justice, Southern honor culture, and sort of what the rivers were like during the antebellum period.
Well, that's great, and I'm kind of glad. Hopefully, we can kind of focus on history or Murder on the Ohio Belle, because I've always wanted to do a true crime podcast. So we'll get to kind of cross over tonight.
Yeah, sounds great. Yep.
Hey, Stuart, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Shenandoah Valley. I think of all the places on earth, I think is one of the most beautiful Americana places. I think of the Shenandoah Valley. Been there many times. Love Washington and Lee University. Been there at Lee Chapel. I've been out there and saw where Robert E. Lee is entombed, and his horse Traveler is buried right outside the chapel beside him. And
right.
It's just a neat place.
Yeah, and it's, really lucky to grow up there. And that made me think of one thing. When I was a kid, me and a buddy of mine, when we were probably 7 or 8 years old, we'd wander over to the Virginia Military Institute, which is right next to Washington and Lee. And we'd go through the museum on campus there, mainly because of the incredible firearms collection that they had. And, the curators would always sort of look at us strangely, who are these 2 kids coming in a museum on a Saturday afternoon? But we were just really interested in military history, and it sort of, carried over into my adult life too. So,
Sure.
You look back at sort of what formulates you in terms of a career, and growing up there certainly did that.
Sure. The cannons there at the that the cadets used in that battle, I thought that fascinated me when I was there. I didn't realize
Yep.
they had little smaller size cannons to train with, and they end up actually using them in a battle. So that was pretty
Wow.
neat. Yeah.
Yeah, they were at the Battle of Newmarket. And there were actually, I think it was around 13 cadets were killed there, or something like that. I know it was around 20 at least. And several of them are actually still buried on posts there.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of reverence toward that battle. And there's a huge painting in the museum there that depicts it. And, again, all that, I worked at the Perryville battlefield. I became director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. And really, growing up sort of entrenched in that Civil War history is one thing that got me interested in historic preservation and, protecting battlefields too. So,
right.
I think it helped me with that first career.
Well, your book, Perryville Under Fire, now I've lived in that area all my life, as you know. I mean, you've known one another for many years. And I learned so much reading that book. Most people, when you talk about the Battle of Perryville, you think about the actual fighting and the real true military historians talking about the maneuvers and who won and what would have happened if this would have done the different and all this. And but most people don't think about is the human toll that it took on the community and the surrounding communities, what life was like for those folks. It was just really, really a day that changed Perryville forever. I always said it would. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that surprised you when you were writing that book?
Yeah, I mean, a ton actually. So, as I mentioned, I worked for the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association, and our office was right downtown in Perryville on Merchants Row. And, it's a row of, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a great row of preserved 1840s commercial buildings. And, one thing I'd always heard working there was that, every house was a hospital. All these churches were makeshift field hospitals. And so in digging into the research, I literally found, every home, church, barn, shed, stable, anything with a business, anything with a roof essentially became a field hospital to deal with not only all of these wounded soldiers, but the thousands of sick men who also traveled with the armies. And there was a terrible drought in Kentucky in October of 1862, and soldiers were forced to drink out of really stagnant, muddy pools of water. And of course, they became sick. And, all those things interested me a lot. But one thing that really shocked me was just sort of how big the footprint of the aftermath of the battle was. And you look at all these communities that suffered, Bardstown had wounded troops, Lebanon had wounded troops, Harrodsburg and Danville did too. And, Danville at the time had roughly 4,000 inhabitants, and there were more than 3,500 sick Union troops who were left in the courthouse, in private homes, and in churches in town, and, completely overwhelmed the community. That'd be like having 15,000 sick people dropped in Danville today, and we couldn't handle that now. And they certainly couldn't handle it then. But, the thing that really got me was the fact that, there were a lot of Union soldiers from the Midwest who were obviously fighting in Kentucky's largest battle at Perryville. And when they were wounded or killed, their relatives from Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin would come down to Perryville, visit the battle, and either try to find their wounded loved ones, or they would try to find, the graves of their slain brothers and sons. And, uncovering a lot of, there's one letter, there was a man from Ohio who found the burial site of members of the 105th Ohio Infantry Regiment, which was literally, if you all know where the cornfield is on the battlefield, they were sort of buried right by White's Road, where White's Road sort of turns behind the cornfield between what we call the Open Knob and Starkweather's Hill. And they were buried in a line. And this man from Ohio came down, found his son's remains, and he wrote a letter back to his hometown paper, basically explaining how to find the graves, what the initials meant on each stone or each, wooden plank that had their initials scratched on it. But then, what sort of really made me shudder was he sort of offered advice on the best time of year to get the corpse and where he should, you could procure a coffin in town. And so, you have this man who's suffering from his own grief, finding his slain son at Perryville, but he still has, sort of the community love and the community pride to tell his hometown, if you're coming here to find your own loved one, these are the steps you need to take to do it. And so things like that were just really moving.
Right.
Um,
You know,
so,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I was just gonna say, so finding out about all these people who came down to the battlefield and, exhumed the remains of their loved ones and found their loved ones, that's what really sort of moved me the most.
What is the total number buried there in that area of the Perryville battlefield?
It's unknown, actually. And so the Union dead were first buried in regimental plots. They were then moved to the Perryville National Cemetery that was west of town. But that, the federal government could never get sort of a good claim on the property there. So they ended up moving the dead again to Camp Nelson. And the sad part is the records were lost. If you go to the old part of the Camp Nelson National Cemetery, most of the dead who were buried there are listed as unknown. And then the Confederates were buried in several pits on the battlefield. There's the monument there, and most of them are buried under there. And others are buried on what was historically the Goodnight Farm, too. But, when we were preserving the battlefield, we always looked at it like just a large cemetery, because you figured that there were graves that were never found or were never dug up. So,
right.
It's that's one reason it's sort of hollowed ground. It's not only because men fought there, but, I'm sure that there's still people buried on that site beyond, the marked cemeteries.
Sure. Stuart, one of the things I learned in your book was the closest hospital, and you correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm remembering incorrectly, but the closest hospital that could handle any amount of wounded was New Albany, Indiana.
Well, it was more, that was one of the farthest places that the wounded ended up getting to. And so it was interesting, because if the farther you could get away from the battlefield, if you were wounded, the better. I mean, I think it improved your chances of survival. So you had a lot of walking wounded and men transported in wagons who were, eventually taken back to Louisville. And so, not only are the surrounding communities like Harrisburg and Danville and Springfield dealing with the wounded, but, again, there were so many casualties that they were taken to New Albany. And part of the problem was there was a lack of food, there was a lack of water, and there was a lack of medicine. Because Don Carlos Buell, who was the Union general in command at Perryville, ordered that only one ambulance should accompany every brigade, which essentially means that there was one small wagon of medical supplies for every 2,300 men in the Union Army. So there were, no chloroform to dull the pain of the wounded. So we know that hundreds of amputations went on without any anesthesia whatsoever. And, pretty shocking to think about, especially when you consider that around the Henry P. Bottom House, one young boy who traveled from Springfield said that there was a pile of arms and legs that stood some 4 or 5 feet high. So again, hundreds of amputations that went on without any anesthesia. There were hospitals spread out all over the state who were dealing with, the effects of that battle.
Right. One of the things that they didn't have any knowledge of at that time was germs. And it's just surprising. People forget that, And so then, obviously, after the battle, you had all this disease break out. And so you had people that were there for a long time after the battle, the recuperation.
Yeah. I mean, weeks and weeks. I think the last hospital closed in March of 1863. So you go from October 1862 till March of 1863. And then those people who were there in March were taken to Danville and other communities where sort of longer term hospitals have been set up. And, you made the great point about not understanding germs, because, because of this drought, not only did it spread illnesses among the soldiers, but there's one Union doctor who said that he didn't have enough water to wash the blood from his hand for 2 days. So you figure this doctor's, performing surgeries. He's checking on wounded men and sick men, just, sort of spreading disease. And, one very sad story to emerge from the battle is that of Colonel Curran Pope, who was a colonel of the 15th Kentucky Infantry Regiment. He fought on the hill above Henry P. Bottom's house on the Union right flank. And he was actually wounded in what was called, the fleshy part of his shoulder during the battle. But he ended up dying weeks later from typhoid. So he survived the battle, but drank polluted water and ended up catching typhoid and died weeks later. So you have all these sort of forgotten casualties of the battle who were wounded, but either died of disease or died of infections.
Do you know the statistics on? I was trying to remember. I can't remember that. You may know the statistics of how many died from disease versus being actual wounded.
Yeah, I didn't get that sort of in the weeds on the casualty numbers, but I remember Bill Boss, who's a local doctor, had done some work on, the number of men who died of post-battle infections. And I think, the last person who died, it was, 8 months after the battle, you had a man who died sort of as a result of an infected wound. So, again, these casualties went on for months and months and months after the battle. And so long after the firing stopped, long after the black powder smoke was cleared away from, the hills above Perryville, men were still dying from illnesses and from these wounds.
Right. I think that's something too. Most people, or the common lay person, when they go to a place like the Perryville battlefield, don't really consider. They just think about the war, the battle itself, but they don't think of all the side components that caused to death and a lot of the tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And, the civilian cost is something, too, that I explored in that book. And, Henry P. Bottom, who owned most of the land upon which the battle was fought, I mean, his farm was literally swept clean. I mean, he had a barn that was hit by an artillery shell and caught on fire. But he had, I think he lost 9 cows, 30 sheep, 22 tons of hay, 3,500 pounds of pork, about 4,000 pounds of bacon, 2 horses. And, the list of his losses just goes on. And he was personally never reimbursed for those losses. It was around $80,000 of goods in today's money. And there's one person commented later that for the first time ever, Henry P. Bottom and his family had to buy food to eat because, they'd been self-sufficient farmers forever. And then, again, soldiers swept the land clean and, they had to start relying on buying food. So, there are these sort of forgotten costs that we don't really think about today because you go to this pristine battlefield and you see these, beautiful rolling hills and, now there are wildflowers out there and, you think, oh, what a peaceful place. But, that land was trashed after the battle. I mean, there were broken caissons and cannons and dead horses and overturned wagons, pieces of uniforms and guns and knapsacks. The list of it goes on. And, sort of the most harrowing accounts really talk about the free-ranging hogs that were digging up bodies and consuming the dead after the battle. And, that was really, a lot of soldiers remarked upon that. And, they were obviously horrified to see it. We're just sort of shocked by the whole thing. So, I think
some of the stories Stuart passed down in my family was how they just totally, they took the furniture out of the houses. The doors were taken off to use as stretchers. Yeah. And the furniture was burnt because to use for firewood. Yep. And they would basically, of course, anything to eat was gone. I mean, one side or the other would take it. I mean, it was just, there was nothing left. And when those people, 2 days after the battle, they come back home. A lot of them left because they were afraid to get caught up in that crossfire, and they come home to nothing. I mean, had nothing, and lucky to have a house standing, I guess.
Right. But, and one example I always use is the family of Charles King Kirkland lived pretty close to what is now the park entrance. And, they left when the battle was taking place. When they came home, their outbuildings had actually been dismantled and burned for firewood. All their cows and chickens were gone. And every piece of furniture in the house was destroyed and burned, except for one, their cherry dining room table was pulled out in the front yard. It was used as an operating table. And when it rained, the severed arms and legs started sticking up from the dirt. And Mrs. Kirkland basically said, I'm not living here anymore. And the family moved down to Casey County, where Kirkland descendants from his family still live today. So you have this, one battle in one day in 1862 permanently displaced this one family from their home. And, really sad stuff. But I just, it's one thing I found really, really compelling to look at about the battle.
Well, for sake of time, we're going to move on, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Because I want to get your last and latest book that I just finished. And, man, I really enjoyed this book. Now, this is a shift of gears for you.
Right.
And it's, first of all, tell me, where'd you get the idea? How did you discover this story? Where did this come from? Murder on the Ohio Belle.
So I found the story. I was actually doing newspaper research on another project I was looking on, and I was scrolling through some 1856 newspapers online, and I found this really short story, just about 2 paragraphs, about how a dead man was fished out of the Mississippi River, tied to a chair. And so he'd been tied to a chair, thrown in the water somehow, and drowned. And I really thought to myself, I said, well, who did this to this person? Who was this person? Why was he bound up like this and tossed in the river to suffer? What sort of bad luck befell him? And, one thing led to another, and I just started digging into the research and discovered the story. And has a few twists and turns, but it was really interesting to research and, learn more about sort of the history of steamboats and violence on steamboats especially.
Well, a lot of us have, been on the Ohio Belle. I mean, the Belle of Louisville,
right?
The what is the other one? The Delta Queen. I think there's one down New Orleans I was on. I can't remember the name of it. And I've read a lot about steamboats. I've always been fascinated by that era. It seemed to be a real romantic, real luxuriant way to travel. We see pictures of all this. They were very, very well decorated, Victorian furnishings. I mean, really elaborate. But the side of real life, when you really read about how risky it was to travel by steamboat, takes on a whole new dimension, doesn't it?
Well, that's one of the things too. When I think of riverboats, I think river pirates and gamblers.
Right.
That's what comes to my mind. How much does that fit historically with riverboats?
It does. I mean, there was gambling on a lot of boats. The Ohio Belle, for example, it was a side-wheeled steamboat that was built in Cincinnati, and it ran the Ohio and Mississippi rivers between Cincinnati and New Orleans, delivering goods and passengers. And there's one account. There was a gambler on board he called them suckers, but he would sort of separate suckers from their money playing games of 3-card monte. And the problem was, though, the captain came up and wanted to play, and the gambler didn't want to play with him, and the captain bet a large sum and lost. And so then the captain shut down the game. And, the gambler sort of kicked himself for ever letting the captain play. But eventually he gave the captain his money back, and they ended up playing it. But, one thing that interested me in doing this book is sort of finding out how dangerous it really was to ride on a steamboat. I mean, boilers weren't necessarily manufactured well, so the risk of explosion was sort of ever present on board. And, I think the statistic is around 21% of all antebellum riverboats either burned or exploded. And most boats only lasted an average of 5 years on the river. So, you took your life in your own hands when you were traveling on one of these things, because there was no regulation or, very little oversight. There was some regulation of the law books, but pretty dangerous. And then, in this case, the Ohio Belle, you have a murder on board. That's the central focus of the book. So in an era where a lot of people carried either concealed Bowie knives or pistols, these steamboats with a lot of whiskey and gambling and armed men and sort of Southern honor culture could be a pretty deadly crucible for people, when weapons and a lot of liquor and gambling was involved.
And I'm sure river travel during this time was like a major freeway, compared to today. I mean, there was a lot of goods, a lot of people traveled this way.
Yeah, I mean, they were hauling tons and tons of freight at ports up and down the river. And I found on the Ohio Belle, there was two presidential elections where, there were well over, 15 to 20 states represented. So you had this sort of, they were kind of the great equalizer in terms of bringing together all these cultures. And, slaves were transported on these river boats. And the book talks a little bit about a fugitive slave case that they were involved in, for example. But, every sort of cargo was carried, from passengers to whiskey and butter and livestock and all sorts of things. So it was sort of the super highway of the 1850s.
Stuart, I was in Kansas City a few years ago, and we stopped at a museum there called the Arabia Steamboat Museum.
Oh yeah, it's great.
And
I've been there.
You've been there, and if anybody's out there and wants to go to that, I'm telling you, if you want to get an eye opening on what was on a riverboat. This boat went down, for our listeners, this boat went down, 1851 or something like that.
Right.
And the river moved, and the boat ended up in the middle of a cornfield. And anyway, this father and his sons dug it up, basically, and put all the stuff in the museum. And it was absolutely mind-boggling how much the volume of stuff that was on one of these boats. So they were a huge, you had the gambling and the people being transported, but you had a lot of cargo and goods going on up and down the river too, didn't you?
Oh yeah, tons and tons of the cargo. And that's why when one of these things burned or exploded, it was such a loss for people, because this is what was stocking general stores all up and down the South. They were getting pork, of course, was huge in Cincinnati. Pork packing was major, and so Cincinnati was sending a lot of meat down south. Kentuckians, of course, were sending whiskey down south. And then furniture, and there's even one account I found where the Ohio Belle delivered the first sort of fire extinguisher down to New Orleans for the first time. And so, they're even getting kind of technological advancements thanks to steamboat travel too. And of course, then railroads came around and really knocked the wind out of the sails in terms of steamboats, of course. But there were still active steamboats up and down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, well into the early 20th century.
Could you tell us a little bit about your book without giving the ending away?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, in March of 1856, the Ohio Belle stopped in Smithland, Kentucky, which is on the Ohio River near Paducah. And a Mississippian got on board who appeared to have been drinking. And he sort of claimed to have come from a very prominent family. And when he got on board, he started drinking again, went to a barber for a shave and a haircut. And when he tried to pay the boat's clerk, the clerk said the money was counterfeit. And of course, this started a fight, and the Mississippian began screaming at the clerk, who then basically manhandled him out of the cabin. And after he pushed this clerk or pushed this Mississippian out of the cabin, the Mississippian promptly pulled a pistol and shot and killed him. It was sort of this great affront, for a quote unquote lower class clerk to put his hands on an aristocratic Mississippian. And, when you shoot someone on a steamboat, of course, you have nowhere to run. And he ran up to the top of the deck. The crew caught him, beat him severely. And thanks to a very famous actress named Matilda Heron, who was on board, even though the crew was about to lynch the man or drown the Mississippian, she managed to do this emotional appeal and saved him. So they decided to then tie him up to a chair by the engine room. And then, of course, the man disappeared. And as Harold mentioned, I found the story because a man was found drowned in the Mississippi River. So his fate is fairly clear what happened to him. But there is a twist in the story in that he was a Mississippian, but he wasn't who he said he was. He had sort of a really dark checkered past. So the story really looks at, through the lens of this murder, it's about interpersonal violence, it's about vigilante justice, and it's about Southern honor culture all wrapped into that. And we sort of tend to forget that in the 1850s, it was a pretty rough and tumble time for justice and law enforcement. Around that time, in 1855, for example, there were the Bloody Monday riots in Louisville, where on an election day, members of the Know Nothing Party attacked and beat and killed dozens of Irish and German immigrants who were out voting. And, sort of mob rule and vigilante justice was pretty, unfortunately common along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So what happened on that boat was essentially a reflection of kind of the broader culture.
Well, you'd mentioned the Southern honor culture. Can you talk about it just a little bit, what it was like during that time?
Yeah, sure. And so honor is essentially how your community viewed you as an upper class white Southerner. And it was sort of like your own self-perception and how that was reflected by your larger community. And the main thing that these Southerners wanted to avoid was public shame. And so in this instance, when this lower class clerk manhandled the Mississippian out, he sort of insulted the man's manhood and also his honor, because what it meant was in a Southern culture, if you were treated poorly by someone of your same class, you might challenge that man to a duel. But if a lower class person insulted you, you're expected to respond with violence almost immediately. And typically it was horsewhipping or caning the person. And so this was sort of this set of external rules that guided society among, upper class white Southerners. And in this instance, again, the crew of this boat didn't respect the Mississippian's claimed honor that he had this only choice was to shoot this poor clerk who was, among the favorites. So, the honor culture stuff's very interesting too, and really guided Kentucky in a lot of ways and guided the rest of the South, at least among upper class people. And there's a noted Kentucky attorney named Ben Hardin, who's from Bardstown, and he called these people sort of the Bowie knife and pistol gentry because they were known to sort of, wander around with, armed to the teeth. And as one person said, they'd pull a pistol if a cat tread on their toe. Sort of hypersensitive and ready to use violence as a means of conflict resolution. And so, digging into that was pretty interesting. And it's kind of one of the sort of guiding threads throughout the book about, how does violence sort of use. Yeah, go ahead, Harold.
You know how that kind of plays into us in the Civil War. Stuart, you remember that a lot of the units fought with people from their community.
Right.
And, there was many instances of where they would, we had to work on a microphone here just a second. Okay. There were many instances where they would go into a battle, charge a position that seemed to be just crazy. Why would you do that?
Right.
And the whole thing is they'd rather I guess, die in battle than to go home and be called a coward. I mean,
Yeah, and
it was that important to them. They'd really rather charge into a like Pickett's charge at Gettysburg or something. They'd rather do that than go home and be labeled a coward.
right. And I think, even modern warfare has those instances too, where it's, you don't want to let down the guy next to you. Because I remember this clear as day. I was given a tour of the Perryville battlefield one time to a Civil War roundtable, and this lady said, "Why would they charge a hill like that?" And we were at the bottom house, and I remember this man turned to me. He was an older guy, and he said, "Well," he goes, "hell, I charged a machine gun nest by myself in the Korean War." And so, that just sort of stopped everybody in their tracks. And, those moments of sort of heroism, it's mainly to save sort of the guy next to you. But, one interesting, to tie it back to Perryville again, the whole honor culture thing, I wrote my third book on George Earl Maney's brigade. And after the Battle of Perryville, Maney was essentially charged with cowardice. There was a doctor who claimed that he didn't advance with his troops, that he was sort of lurking in the rear. And the reason was because Maney his horse had gotten spooked and kicked him in the head. So he wasn't able to go with his troops the whole time. But Maney actually challenged this doctor to a duel, and they fought a duel as a result of that. So, even honor existed after Perryville in that sense of people, taking insult so seriously and using that honor culture as a means to settle a conflict and prove their, manhood, essentially.
Well, what were the people like that worked on the river boats?
That's a great question. I mean, it was a really interesting mix of people. I mean, you had a lot of immigrants, you had freed African Americans, you had some enslaved people who were leased out to different river boats. And so it was just a wild mix. And, again, you have this mix of people. That's one reason violence was so prevalent. And, I've found one instance recently where a guy talked about how all these Irish immigrants on board would sort of sneak and get into the whiskey, and then he'd have to go down, under the boat and sort of break up the fights that were happening. So, it was a pretty rough transient life for people. They would hop from boat to boat and work, different places, and, essentially lived on the rivers. John Sebastian, who was the captain of the Ohio Belle, who eventually lost his arm in the Civil War while piloting a Union gunboat. And I talk about, the Belle's sort of history during the Civil War too. He actually started as a riverboat pilot apprentice at age 15. So, these people lived on the river their entire lives and worked on the river their entire lives. And, what amazed me is, these riverboat pilots were just unflappable. I mean, some of the bravest people. And you think about it, if you can guide a massive riverboat down sort of a raging Mississippi River at night during a storm, nothing's going to scare you. And, stories like that have always really, really compelled me.
Well, was the Ohio Belle captured at one time by the South?
Yeah, it was. So it was a Cincinnati-owned boat. And the interesting thing, like during the secession crisis, they're still running, you had states seceding all over the place, and they were still running goods between Cincinnati and New Orleans. And one time when they were down in New Orleans, the governor of Arkansas demanded that all Cincinnati steamboats be seized because residents of Cincinnati had taken weapons that were supposed to be heading down to the Arkansas militia. So when the Ohio Belle pulled into Napoleon, Arkansas on the Mississippi River to get some wood to refuel, sort of a ragtag bunch of secessionists pointed a cannon at the boat, pointed muskets at it and took it over. And so it was under Confederate hands for a number of months. And then finally, after the Battle of Island Number 10, it ended up going back into Union hands, and the Union Army refused to turn it over to the owners. And so it then for a number of years was used as a hospital ship and a troop transport and had this, sort of crazy history as a Civil War vessel. But the captain of the boat, John Sebastian, who I mentioned earlier, he was so angry that, these secessionists had stolen his boat. He immediately enlisted in the Union Army, became a gunboat pilot. And again, he was fighting the ironclad Confederate boat, the Arkansas, in a horrific battle, and ended up losing his arm. And, he eventually piloted riverboats again after the war. And then he became the treasurer of Cincinnati, which was pretty lucrative, and finally moved to Emporia, or to Kansas, where he became a cattle baron. So, his life, which I talk about in the book, is pretty interesting too. There's a lot of crazy stories.
Stuart, one of the little detail things that we don't think about in our podcast, we try to bring some things like this out. And that is one of the things I've noticed about pictures, photographs that I see along rivers in this time. There's not a tree standing anywhere.
Right.
And people and just think about now, you're going to take a boat that costs several $1,000s, probably in today's money, millions of dollars, and you're going down a river. And although it's a major river in America, you're still going to depend on local people cutting wood, cording it up, that you could pull in and load wood so you can fire your boilers to keep going down the river.
Yeah, and that's something people don't think about. I think a lot of people just assume it's coal that was being burned, but, more often it was wood. And there were, hundreds of wood yards that, like a plantation in Arkansas, for example, would set up if it ran up to the river. A big part of their business would be just having, their enslaved people chopping up wood all day and then selling it to steamboats. And, that became, was a major economic impact on a lot of these farms and plantations. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the wood was gone all up and down the river, with the exception, a lot of times, too, some trees would just fall in and then would create snags in the river that would also endanger the boat. So,
yeah, today we have like Corps. I know my uncle did that. He was worked on the Corps engineers, and their job was to dredge out, the main navigation channels along the Ohio, Kentucky, and I guess Mississippi as well. But in this day and time, that none of that was done. You depend on the skill of that riverboat captain to avoid those things.
And how many during this time? How many riverboats would be running from Cincinnati to Louisiana?
Well, a fair number actually. It's sort of around 1855, there were about 700 riverboats on Western rivers, and so that would include everything from the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Arkansas, the Kentucky, and all those tributaries. So you probably had about, between 10 and 12 running a pretty regular route between those two cities specifically. But you also had Cincinnati-based boats who were going to St. Louis, or they're going up the river toward Pittsburgh. So, Cincinnati was sort of, and Louisville too, were major steamboat manufacturing areas. And, they had dozens of boats leaving there every day. And if you go to the Cincinnati Public Library's website, they have an 1848 panoramic photograph of the Cincinnati River front, and the Ohio Belle is actually pictured in that. And finding that, as Harold knows, doing a lot of research. I mean, it's that one sort of holy grail moment where, you find this picture, and I was shocked. There were actually 3 boats that ran under the name the Ohio Belle, and the first 2 probably burned. And this was a picture of the second one. It was built, I think it was around 1846, I think. And finding that was incredible. But if you go to the Cincinnati Public Library website, you can actually look at that panoramic image that shows you, the businesses and the boats that just, thrived on that riverfront. I mean, constantly boats coming up and down the river. And
so would a company have, say, a riverboat leaving Cincinnati and then have one in Louisiana, or St. Louis leaving the same time? I mean, was there like a circuit? How did that operate?
Exactly. Yeah. They were called packet boats. And sort of the packet boat concept was that, exactly as you explained it, you'd have, a number. The idea was that a packet boat would leave from a specific port at a specific time, heading to another port at that specific time. So yeah, while, the Ohio Belle was leaving Cincinnati, for example, the Queen of the West or the Mars or another boat would be heading upriver, and, they'd pass somewhere, hopefully in the middle. And that's one reason that, riverboat travel became so dangerous, because you had these competing packet lines that would urge their, these crews, you've got to make a better time, because if we're the fastest boat on the river, we'll sell more tickets and more people will, put their freight on board. But the problem was, it was racing on boats that caused a lot of the explosions. And there was one in 1838 called the Moselle that had been racing, and that explosion right outside of Cincinnati, which killed dozens of people, I think, really led to the first sort of steamboat regulations in the country. So you have these accidents that actually cause regulations, but it was that need for speed and that need to, show off that you were the fastest boat that ended up, costing a lot of lives, including the crew and the captains on a number of these vessels.
Well, what a great story. Thank you for being part of our podcast tonight. Real quick, where could folks find your books?
They're available on the University Press Kentucky website. They're available on Amazon.com. If you search for Murder on the Ohio Belle, or if you find my author page, which is just search for Stuart, Stuartw Sanders. That's where you'll find me. So I appreciate you guys having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, definitely want to have you back. This is the first time we've actually interviewed. We've kind of changed our format up tonight, and you have been a great guest.
Oh,
Stuart,
thanks.
Thank you so much.
Really,
really enjoyed it. You and I have known one another a long time. I really respect you as a historian and a great guy, and I knew it would be good, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Harold. I really appreciate you all having me.
Definitely,
Thanks so much.
Hopefully we can have you back in the future. So,
hey, anytime, Brian. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for being part of Uncommon History of the South podcast. If you would like to help support our podcast, please share our podcast with your friends. Leave a 5-star review and comment. This will help others find our podcast. And you can now find us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So please make sure to like us, subscribe, and follow. And we'll be back next week with a new episode of Uncommon History of the South.